what I've become. The nightmare's just begun. I must confess that I feel like a monster. I feel it deep within, it's just beneath the skin. I must confess that I feel like a monster. I'm gonna lose control, it's something radical. I must confess that I feel like a monster. I feel like a monster. I feel like a monster.
Very little is known about James's early life up until he would meet a woman named Colette, and the two would fall in love, getting married and eventually having a daughter named Maya. James would then enlist into the Marines, eventually becoming a sergeant. However, back in New York, the Blacklight virus masquerading as Gentech scientist Alex Mercer would cause a second outbreak, and James would rush home to protect his family. However, upon returning to New York, James would find Colette dead and Maya nowhere to be found, presumed dead as well. Would have no other goal than killing Alex. James would then be deployed into New York Zero's Red Zone, where the infection was at its strongest. His armored personnel carrier would be attacked by Mercer, and as soon as he recovered, James would chase Mercer, evading a Goliath and killing a brawler with nothing but his knife. Seeing this, Mercer would become interested in James and would infect him with the Blacklight virus. James would then be captured by Blackwatch, only to break free and then once again be ambushed by Mercer, who would have James consume a Blackwatch soldier, revealing their involvement in the creation of the virus, convincing James that he had been framed and to help him destroy them as well as the virus. Seeking guidance, James would find Father Guerrera, a preacher in his old neighborhood who would become James's informant and would lead James to Dr. Anton Koenig, whom had experimented on James while in Blackwatch's custody. Koenig would convince James that he was trying to reveal that Blackwatch was working on super soldiers as well as revealing the location of the original test subject. However, this would be a trap to set up and kill Heller, but James would kill the super soldier and would return to Koenig to finish what he had started, only for the doctor to attack, revealing himself to be an infected created by Mercer, known as an Evolved. After a brief fight and chase, James would kill and consume Koenig, learning that Mercer had many infected agents in Blackwatch. Alex would then reveal that he had been watching the whole time and would once again try and convince James that his goal was to destroy Blackwatch and the virus. But Heller would see right through his lies, and he and Father Guerrero would work in secret, tracking down another of Alex's Evolved, and the CFO of Gentech, Sabrina Galloway, who would offer to give James information as long as he allowed her to live. After threatening her, James would agree, and using the information she would give him, as well as some gathered by Father Guerrera, James would discover that Gentech had been working on a potential cure for the virus named Whiteheart. However, Mercer had sabotaged the cure with his own blood, making it far more potent than the virus itself. James would find where the cure was being produced, only for Mercer to ambush him and would attempt to kill him, but was unable to do so, swearing to make James suffer and would summon a Goliath to distract James while he murdered Guerrero. James would then find his body and would be contacted by one of Guerrero's allies, Athena, who was living in the Red Zone. James would then return to the zone and would rescue her from Blackwatch, and after this she would reveal that she was Alex's younger sister, Dana Mercer, as well as the fact that James's daughter was alive and being held captive by Blackwatch, and would act as James' primary informant from now on. James would once again meet with Sabrina, who would attempt to convince Heller to leave with her, but Heller would refuse, and using Dana's information would eventually discover that Maya was being held at Gentech HQ, but before he could reach her, Sabrina would take Maya while Alex would kidnap Dana. James would then confront Alex with his remaining involved, and Mercer would consume his remaining minions before he and Heller would fight to the death. And after a long, hard battle, James would wear down Alex's healing factor, disarming him before consuming him as well as the rest of the infection before rescuing Dana and Maya. Kaede was born in an unknown part of Japan shortly before her father would leave her near an orphanage near Kamakura, most likely being disgusted by her horns. Her mother, on the other hand, would spend her entire life searching for her but would never be able to find her. She would grow up in an orphanage where she would be constantly harassed by the other children and would be generally ignored by the staff. Her life would be miserable up until the age of 10, where she would finally find a small bright spot in her life, and a small puppy she would find in the woods and take care of, as well as a fellow orphan who she seemed to befriend. However, this would be short-lived as her supposed friend would tell the puppy's location to a group of boys who liked to torment Kaede, and they would kill her new pet in front of her. Now at her breaking point, Kaede would snap, awakening her vectors for the first time and slaughtering the other children in the room. She would then leave the orphanage and would bury the puppy in the woods. Immediately after, she would meet a young boy named Koda, who seemed to be genuinely not disgusted by her abnormal hair color and horns. And despite recently suffering a huge betrayal, she would take the chance, and the two kids would become close. Eventually, she would make him promise to kill her if she ever started to kill on a massive scale. During this time, she would enter houses in the middle of the night and would kill the families inside so that she would have a place to sleep. Only a few days after meeting Koda, he would reveal that he was only visiting the area and would be leaving after a festival which he would be attending with his cousin. Kaede would then go to the festival to surprise Koda and say goodbye, but she would see him with his cousin Yuka and would assume he liked her. This is when she would encounter her DNA voice for the first time, and after being goaded on by the voice, she would go on a killing spree, which would end when she tracked Kota to a train car where she would kill his father and younger sister, Kanai, in front of him. After he begged his friend not to kill his cousin, Kaede would realize her mistake and would leave the traumatized boy. Over the next 5 years, Kaede would refine her technique, teaching herself to use her vectors in more subtle ways, either giving people heart attacks or using them to infect males with the diclonius virus. Around this time, she would meet a young girl named Aiko, and after an incident that would result in her abusive father's death, Kaede would help the girl find her estranged mother. However, unbeknownst to them, an organization had been tracking Kaede and had found her. After the two were cornered, Aiko would take a bullet, saving Kaede's life, but costing her own. In an attempt to save her friend, Kaede would agree to let the organization capture her, but would be told by a man named Kurama about her friend's fate. Kaede would then swear to kill the people he loved as revenge. It was during this imprisonment that she would be given the name Lucy by the organization. After 3 years of imprisonment, the opportunity to escape would present itself and Lucy would take it, slaughtering dozens of facility guards, as well as a girl who was close to Kurama. However, during the last part of her escape, she would be shot in the head with an anti-material rifle, but would only suffer minor brain damage resulting in a split personality. This new personality would wash up on the shore of Kamakura and would be found by a now-grown Yuka and Kota, who had mentally blocked the memories of his family's death. The two would take the girl in and would name her Niu, after the only word she could speak. After a few days and an incident with some soldiers, the facility would send another diclonius named Nana to retrieve her, but by then, Lucy had resurfaced and would refuse to come back, and after a short fight, Lucy would mutilate her by cutting and ripping off her limbs. Unbeknownst to her, Nana was Kurama's surrogate daughter, and by crippling her, the hatred between them was now mutual. A few weeks later, after taking in a homeless girl named Mayu, Yuka and Kota would somehow decide that taking Niu to a college with them was a good idea, and by sheer coincidence, their teacher, Yu Kakezawa, was the son of the organization's leader, and after lying about Lucy being his niece, he would take Niu. However, after drugging Niu, Lucy would reawaken and Niu would explain that he was the one that created the opportunity for her to escape, that he believed himself to be diclonius as he also had horns, and above all, he intended to be the Adam of the diclonius race with Lucy as the Eve. However, Lucy was having none of this and killed him on the spot. Soon after this, Mayu would find Nana, who had been left for dead by the facility but was saved by Kurama, and would bring her home around the same time Lucy would return. And Nana would attack, but by then, Niu had taken over and would not be able to fight back. After this misunderstanding, Nana would stay at the house mostly to keep an eye out for Lucy. Not long after this, Nana would disappear and Kota and Niu would head out and search for her. The two would eventually be stopped by a police barricade, but Niu would be able to slip past and find Nana, Kurama, and another diclonius named Mariko, who was Kurama's biological daughter. After Kurama would try to kill Niu, Lucy would resurface and would decide to kill everyone there, but Mariko would sacrifice herself in an explosion that would destroy Lucy's horns and cause Niu to take control back. Kurama would once again try to kill her, but Nana would convince her surrogate father to spare Niu, and peace would settle down for about 6 months. During this time, Niu would mature at an advanced rate, growing from the mental state to an infant of that of a young woman. However, while attending college with Yuka and Kota, a soldier that Lucy had mutilated would recognize Niu and would make an attempt on her life, and Lucy would once again return and would agree to fight him on his own terms. The fight would get the attention of both Mayu and Nana, and after the soldier was cut in half, he would shoot off one of her horns, making her revert back to Niu. That night at dinner, a group of soldiers, as well as clones of Mariko, would invade the house, and after seeing her friends brutally mistreated and Kota shot, Niu would use her vectors for the first time, killing many of the soldiers, as well as killing a clone in the same way Kaede had killed Kota's younger sister, causing his memories to return. Realizing the dangers more than she could handle, Niu would give Lucy control, but she would be captured regardless. He would also reveal the circumstances around her abandonment and that her mother had searched for her, until being captured by the organization and had been forced to bear a son by the man before ending her own life. Lucy would respond the same way she had responded to his son, by killing the elder man as well as her half-brother and the being. Lucy would then escape the island, which had begun to sink, and would go to a beach where Kota would be waiting for her. The two then traveled to a lighthouse and Kota would demand answers, and though Lucy answered to the best of her abilities, they would leave Kota unsatisfied and he would refuse to forgive her for her actions. But seeing Niu as a member of the family, he would allow her to live with him if she swore never to kill again. Less than a minute later, Kurama would appear and try to kill Lucy, only for her DNA voice to take direct control and cut off his arm. But this wouldn't stop him, and he would once again shoot at her, only for Kota to take the bullet meant for her. Enraged, Lucy would decide to end the world and would enhance her vectors to the point where they could cover the entire world, and due to the added strain on her body, it would begin to melt down. Realizing she was going to die, she decided to save Kota while fending off heavy weapon fire from all directions, as well as continuing to attack, and now her entire body would start to melt, resulting in the DNA voice taking full control. The spirits of Neo and Lucy would then speak to Coda and would remind him of his promise to kill her before departing. Coda would then retrieve a gun from a fallen soldier but would be unable to do so until the DNA voice itself asked him to end her life. And so, Coda would shoot her, ending all three of their lives at once. Hello and welcome everyone to the first bonus match of Season 3, where I'll be pitting the prototype evolved James Heller up against the Diclonia's Queen Kaede, aka Lucy, in a battle to see which of these two powerhouses made by man and made by natural evolution respectively, to see who I think would come out on top. Now, as a bonus fight, the research and analysis will be coming directly from the episodes that featured them in Season 1, and as such the production quality will reflect that. Now with all that out of the way, let's start by comparing these two physically. During the events of Prototype 2, James Heller is a 38-year-old infected human standing at around 6 feet tall and weighing an unknown amount of pounds due to his fluctuating biomass. James has surpassed his limitations as a human and is capable of doing things no human could ever achieve on their own. James's strength has been enhanced to the point where he can easily lift and throw a car, rip a tank apart with his bare hands, can easily beat other evolved to death, and most impressively overpowered Alex Mercer, who at this point was able to casually throw most of a tank with one hand. Now, considering the turret section of the tank was taken off, I'm going to assume that the tank still has about 80% of its original weight, meaning Alex at this point was capable of casually throwing 40 tons with a single hand. His speed has seen a similar level of advancement, being able to run so fast he moves up walls, react to encounter rocket shots, and battle multiple evolved capable of doing the same thing at once. Being enhanced by the Blacklight virus, James seems to no longer have a limit to his stamina like a standard human. However, his abilities do seem to diminish as he takes damage and loses biomass. James has an amazing healing factor capable of repairing his body from life-threatening burns, blows from powerful infected, and attempted consumption by Alex, and theoretically should be able to have the same regenerative properties, meaning he should be capable of regenerating from literally being beaten to a bloody pulp, as long as he can get access to more biomass. His skin has also been hardened to the point of being bulletproof, and he can easily walk off explosions. At the time of her death, Lucy was an 18-year-old Diclonia's female standing at 5 feet 3 inches and weighing 105 pounds. Even without her vectors, Lucy was shown to possess an advanced level of strength, speed, and durability, having the strength to rip a woman's head off with her bare hands, and at the age of 15 tossed a full-grown man into the ceiling. She nearly dodged a bullet fired at point-blank range and has been shown to heal at a faster rate than humans. However, her stamina seems to be at the standard level for a human. With her vectors, Lucy has shown an even greater feats such as taking out a helicopter, uprooting a tree and throwing it, and tossing a rock that, thanks to Death Battle, we know weighs about 75 tons. Her vectors are fast enough to deflect bullets, move chunks of floor fast enough to protect her after bullets had already been fired, and even once caught a bullet as it hit her, which, once again, according to Death Battle, she would need to be moving at nearly 1900 miles per hour. In terms of stamina, Lucy really doesn't have any feats to speak of, but it's much more likely that it is a bit higher than a normal human like her other physical traits. Without her vectors, Lucy is just as vulnerable as you or me, though she does seem to heal at a faster rate. At standard, Lucy's vectors are capable of stopping bullets and dampening damage from bullets higher than 50 caliber, as well as explosions, though she will still be hurt by these. Now before I move on, some of you may have noticed that I didn't include all of Lucy's feats, especially while she was under the control of the DNA voice. And I do acknowledge these feats, I'm just saving them for the next cat, as they require her to go over her normal limit and as such fall into the special abilities. On paper, this category is pretty clear cut. James, in comparison to Lucy on her own, is no contest. However, once the vectors get involved, it becomes a very different story. Strength is pretty close, with James scaling to Alex, who single-hand tossed an M1 Abrams, and Lucy throwing 75 tons. Sounds like it's clear-cut, as from what I know, there's no model of tank that weighs that much. However, the ease at which Alex threw the tank clearly shows that he could lift far more. To counter that, however, Lucy isn't exactly stressed when she throws the boulder. So this is also a casual feat for her, and I really don't have anything else to examine. So that, along with that, what we do see of her full limit later on, has me comfortable in giving her the strength advantage. Speed is pretty clear cut. Lucy can react to bullets, and James at best dodges rockets. A difference I've gone over many times, but the short answer is that Lucy is much faster. Stamina is kind of weird, but still goes to James, as while Lucy's combat style uses a lot less stamina than Heller's, she does still have a stamina limit, unlike James, who, while yes, can eventually have a stamina drain, still has so much more that it's irrelevant. Durability also goes to James for that frankly broken healing factor, as opposed to Lucy, who has just above normal human durability. So there's Lucy's strength and speed versus James's stamina and durability. Now, I don't feel that stamina will be a big factor here, as Lucy's fighting style almost never requires her to expand energy, or even move if she doesn't feel like it. Durability is a big advantage for James, as it would let him take more hits, evening out the strength advantage Lucy has, allowing him to take her hits and continue getting up. Though, in my opinion, this is just delaying the outcome, as Lucy's speed advantage would give him trouble getting the hit he needs to win. And so, I give Lucy the edge in physical abilities. After being infected with the Blacklight virus, James gained the ability to manipulate his biomass into different weapons. His first ability is the power to absorb any biological creature, granting him their shape as well as their memories. However, when it comes to powerful beings like the infected, they must first be weakened before he can perform this attack. The first of his polymorphic abilities are his claws, which can rip through people with no issue. His hammer fist forms his fist into large spiked balls capable of destroying tanks in just a few blows, and sending large spikes into the surrounding area in a wave. Turns his arm into an extendable whip-like weapon that can rip through multiple opponents at once. His tendrils give him the ability to shoot out his tentacles and plant them into his opponents, causing them to burst open in an AoE attack. His blade is a large knife-like weapon capable of cleaving the large infected in two with one hit. His shields are two spiked shields that can take a serious amount of damage and even deflect objects like missiles back at his opponents. When consuming more biomass than necessary, James gains the ability to expend that biomass in the form of a Devastator attack. His Devastator involves him shooting out a massive amount of tendrils in all directions, as well as the ability to send out pheromones that will make brawlers follow his command and attack whoever he wishes. As a Diclonius, Lucy is born equipped with a number of vectors, invisible 3-meter-long arms that vibrate at frequencies that allow them to lift, phase through, and cut objects like solid stone. Lucy can also increase the strength of her vectors to the point where she can destroy battleships, can tear down buildings, defend herself against missiles, somehow created a storm, and destroyed an island with one punch, creating a 9.2 earthquake, or even make her vectors long enough to reach into space. However, using this kind of power will cause her body to deteriorate and will kill her, and as such, she realistically wouldn't use this level of power on a single opponent unless the DNA voice took over or as a last resort. She also has a very minor healing factor which allows her to heal at a higher rate than humans. However, this really isn't regeneration and it does take a lot of time to get done. Okay, so before I get people in the comments that telling me that just because Lucy has a nuke punch and James can't take a nuke, that means she wins by default. No, that would kill her, and I'm tackling this fight assuming that neither fighter is going into this with a death wish. Now, on paper, Lucy has the edge here as her powers are simply more effective than James's. Her vectors can cut better than any of James's blades, have better range, hit harder, are faster. And the only areas that he has in his favor are regeneration and spreading the virus, which he wouldn't be willing to do. But there are some powers I'd like to go over individually that could be more useful against Lucy. First off, James's ability to disguise himself wouldn't put Lucy at any disadvantage, as James first of all wouldn't want to kill some random civilian to get one over on Lucy, and even if he did, she wouldn't care about killing a group of randoms to get to him, as she actually feels a need to kill humans, rendering it a waste of time for James. Whip Fist is honestly just a slower, less effective vector serving the same purpose, but Lucy can see it and thusly counter it. James's shield would be useless, as Lucy's vectors ignore conventional durability and can cut through anything by vibrating at certain frequencies, and she's been shown to hit at strengths that would shatter the shield. Really, there's only one power that James had that would be effective: consuming her. As she's only a bit stronger than humans, he'd have no problem. But there's just one issue. He needs to get in close enough to hit her, and at that range, he's better off just going for a normal kill. A quick reminder, since I'm sure there are plenty who think that Blacklight is a more viable power set overall compared to Vectors, and you'd be right to think so, but this category isn't about whose powers are overall better, but whose powers are more useful against the person they're up against. And in a one-on-one direct fight, James's powers don't stack up to Vector's, and so I give Lucy the edge in special abilities. Lucy's use of her vectors could best be described as a painfully basic variation of Form 1 Sheet Show, which primarily relies on wide sweeping attacks best used on groups, as well as some proficiency in Form 3 Srisu, which focuses on blocking until an opportunity is created due to fatigue or frustration. Lucy has shown a fair bit of skill and cleverness in blocking bullets and even involving the environment to defend herself. Tactically, Lucy is the single most straightforward fighter I've ever seen. almost always attacking her opponents head-on with her vectors, throwing objects at her opponents, and very, very rarely using stealth tactics when the opportunity presents itself. James Heller mainly fights using wide swings meant to take down multiple opponents at once, and as such, his fighting style would best be attributed to Form 1 Sheet Show, which, while good against large groups, can easily be countered by a single well-trained opponent. James is a highly skilled hand-to-hand fighter, as shown when he was able to land several hits on Alex before being infected and was able to kill a brawler with only his knife only a few minutes afterward. James has been shown to use pretty simple combat tactics post-Blacklight infection, as his primary tactic is to use his superior physical abilities and deadly to overwhelm his opponents for a quick kill. In theory, James should be a master tactician, as all the soldiers and higher-up military officials he has absorbed should give him an intimate knowledge of military combat tactics as well as counter tactics. However, James has been shown to be easily enraged, which could lead him to blindly attacking or chasing his opponent into a disadvantageous position, such as when Alex used Maya to lure James into a trap and then consumed a group of Evolved to overwhelm James. So this category is very simple and probably the easiest I've ever had to call. James is a military genius with centuries of combined experience to draw from, as well as battling dozens of other Evolved, showing the skill needed to deal with other superpowered beings. And Lucy, for her part, is admittedly clever in her use of powers, but it's nothing too advanced and mostly just using her environment to her advantage, which James is more than capable of. And while James does have a temper that could lead him into acting in a less than strategic way, Lucy wouldn't know how to exploit this or even how to piss him off other than just being difficult to fight. There is absolutely no question that James gets the edge in combat skills and tactics. Let's set up this fight. Let's say that it takes place in the Diclonius research facility where James has been ripping his way into after discovering what was happening after absorbing a Gentech scientist who happened to be involved with both projects. James dropped down from the ceiling, landing on one of the guards, crushing him. The other quickly pulls his revolver but is pulverized by a backhand from James. Immediately after the guard's death, the sound of metal bending and breaking as Lucy frees herself from her cage gets James's attention. The two stare each other down, James approaching slowly like trying to get close to a stray animal, keeping his voice low and wanting to keep her calm. He wasn't sure what this girl was capable of, only that she was dangerous. However, if he didn't need to kill her, he wanted to avoid it. Lucy, seeing this, took a moment to remove her helmet before looking over to James, giving him a once-over before taking one step and cutting him in half. She starts to walk away when she hears meat tearing and turns to see James putting himself back together, as tendrils drag the nearby bodies over to him and replacing his biomass. Lucy takes a step back, asking who, and more importantly, what was he? Heller doesn't say anything, having decided that after that little stunt he was putting the girl down, and forms his tendril arms shooting them at her. But only a few feet from hitting her, they're stopped, with some being blocked and others seemingly being cut out of thin air. James feels something grab his remaining tendrils and he's swung into a wall, shattering bones and parts of his body bursting open in from the force. Dragging himself to his hands and knees, he starts coughing up blood until his lungs fix themselves, and looks up to see Lucy staring down at him. That would have killed anyone else. You're something special, aren't you? James responds by forming his claws and taking a swing at her. She jumps back with her vectors, but James is too fast, reaching her and going for a decapitation. But his claws hit something he can't see. He tries for a moment to cut through the invisible barrier, while Lucy watches and tells him that he's wasting his time and to just give up and let her escape. James raises his claws to bring down her defense, but as they swing down, they're severed and her vectors grab James by the throat, slamming him into the ground so hard that the back of his head cracks open. The back of his head cracks as blood pools around him. Lucy then adds a second vector to grip and begins to push down on Heller, who regenerates and tries to pry the invisible hands away. The vectors eventually push so hard they rip through his skin and reach bones. And while James is pretty sure he would survive a decapitation, he isn't really willing to risk it and forms his hammer fist, slamming them down into the floor, which collapses under them and they both fall into the lower labs. The Diclonians gets to her feet, but feeling a sharp pain in her side, looks down as a large purple and yellowish bruise is forming at her ribs, as well as spotting one that's clearly broken. Her attention is drawn back to James, who screams as he jumps up with his hammer fists and brings him down to Diclonius, who again raises her vectors to protect herself. However, now she's unable to fully stop him and only dampens the blow as blood spills from her head. James then strikes again as she's sent flying into a wall. Lucy tries to get up, but only gets to her knees before falling back. Looking up, she sees James change his arms and walks over. Then, out of the corner of her eye, she spots one of her horns on the ground. Feeling her head, she feels nothing but a swollen lump and starts to see red. James walks over to finish her when all of a sudden she's flying at him. Reacting as fast as he can, James forms his shield. Lucy doesn't even bother cutting through it, and with a barrage of vectors, shatters the shield. James immediately tries to reform the shield on the other hand, but it's immediately severed. Not even a second later, a hole is punched through his chest and he's lifted into the air. She then removes his legs, followed by his head, before splitting the body down the middle. Reasonably assuming that the collection of severed body parts was no longer a threat, Lucy begins to walk away when the snarling of a large beast catches her attention. Turning back to see a pack of brawlers, Lucy makes quick work of two and decides to rip apart the third. However, then she notices that the final one had stayed back and was chowing down on James's remains, when the lump of flesh in its mouth sprouts tendrils that dig into the brawler's brain, killing it instantly, and converts the biomass into himself, reforming in seconds. Lucy grinds her teeth and once again demands to know what he was. James, not really caring to explain what he knew about his altered biology, says that he doesn't really care what he was. All he knew was that he was going to take her down, before expelling all of his extra biomass in a devastator, shooting dozens of tendrils all over the room, which Lucy manages to block. She smirks at him, saying that she hoped that that wasn't supposed to be his trump card, to which he replies saying, "Nah, I just figured it was time to bury the freak show." And with that, he pulls the tendrils back, ripping the ceiling down on it. Lucy again uses her vectors to defend herself, only suffering minor injuries. But as she crawls out, her arm is yanked up as James tightens his grip on her before throwing her over his shoulder. Lucy hits a wall, at first not feeling anything. Then, as she stands back up, something warm starts pulling at her feet. Looking down, she realizes that James hadn't just thrown her. He had ripped off her arm. Pain and panic come out in a horrified scream as she falls back, cradling her severed limb, as James looks at the limb and thinks to himself, then crushes the arm in his grasp and absorbs it, the diclonius DNA mixing with his own, as he feels a pair of jagged black horns grow from his skull, and a new transparent but shadowy set of limbs sprout from his back. James also takes a moment to process her memories as Lucy gets back to her feet, now genuinely enraged at the abomination of her own ability mixed with blacklight before her. Her vectors lash out to rip him apart yet again, but James now has a set of his own that stop her, and with speed even she can't comprehend, begins to pummel her. Lucy does what she can to hold them off until, from the side, one sprouts up a growth of biomass that shifts into his blade, before flicking it like a whip, cutting her in half the same way she had done to him at the start of their fight. James stood over Lucy as she succumbed to her injuries, thinking that he should probably thank her for the new powers. They'd certainly help in bringing down the remnants of Gemtech. Maybe he'd name the powers after her. Call them crazy punk bitch hands. Nah, he'd work on it another time. Right now, he had some brains to dig through. And with that, I declare James Heller, the Blacklight Alpha, the winner. Right, so this outcome might confuse some of you, as Lucy had everything she needed to take James out, and she certainly could under the right conditions, even without taking herself out in the process. The issue is that she would either have to somehow get her hands on weapons or be in an environment where she could exploit to destroy him completely. However, on neutral ground, this wouldn't be an option. And while James is at a disadvantage with his powers, he still has everything he needs to eventually take Lucy down. Physical abilities is mainly dominated by Lucy due to her vectors. But don't forget that James is still a powerhouse in every area himself. And one good hit, or even a glancing blow for being honest, would take her out. And when you have the regeneration needed to last basically forever, eventually you're going to get that hit. It's just that it's probably going to take James literal hours to do so thanks to her power set. Speaking of powers, it's basically the same explanation thanks to how I count regeneration as both a physical and special ability, so I'm not going to repeat myself. What I will say, however, is that the vectors would allow Lucy to hold James off for a good amount of time. But without any method of taking him out for good, this is a moot point. Combat skills was firmly in Heller's corner, as Lucy lacks the skill and experience to take full advantage of her powers, while James has been operating longer against more dangerous threats, on top of his military background. So why did Lucy lose if she's stronger and James would barely be able to touch her thanks to the vectors? Well, the first and biggest reason is his regeneration, which demands that you destroy every cell of his body, and with just the biomass of a crow being enough for him to completely regenerate, since he scales to Alex. And while true, James wouldn't want to kill random civilians to get an advantage, he's not above it, and several moments in-game have been putting innocents in danger for his own goals. So if push comes to shove, I think James would be willing to do so. So while Lucy is capable of destroying every cell of James's body, A, she'd need to kill herself to do so, and B, she wouldn't be able to put enough distance between them to actually try it. While Lucy would probably be pushed to the point where her body's deteriorating, I don't think she'd be willing to nuke herself in order to win, and the DNA voice would probably be more focused on killing the humans than protecting herself. But that's just my opinion. What do you guys think? Do you agree that the infective sergeant would take the Diclonius King out, or do you think that Lucy would take his spot at the top of the food chain? Let me know what you think in the comments down below, and if I got anything wrong, please feel free to correct me. Right, please rate, comment, and subscribe if you enjoyed this video, as I have plenty more like it. I also have a Twitter and Discord where you can talk to me directly, as well as links to the channels Winter Ghost and 3 Tactics Gamer, all in the description. Right, with all that, I'm Ray932, and I'll see you next time.